My name is Margaret Waterbury. I'm the editor-in-chief of Distiller magazine, and today we are talking to Andrea Fujarczuk, who is a professor at the University of, I want to say Niagara College. Is that right? Andrea,
Niagara
can you
Falls?
give us a little brief bio about yourself?
Sure. My name is Andrea Fujarczuk. I'm a full-time professor at Niagara College. I'm also a doctoral student at Heriot-Watt University, and I am basically investigating the value of origin and how a product comes from affects the value of that product. And I've also worked for Moët Hennessy in London, England. I've distilled over at Thames Distillers, but right now I'm really enjoying researching and writing articles such as this that hopefully make a difference to somebody.
Awesome. Yeah, Andrea did a story in the spring issue of Distiller about geographical indications that was super fascinating. And the thing about print is that we're always constrained in the length of what we can publish. And so this story for me almost like opened more questions than it answered, or it just provided so many interesting avenues for discussion. So maybe to start with, like for people who haven't read the story yet or who are new to this concept, like what is a GI or a geographic indication? Or, I mean, there's a lot of different, it depends on where you are, what we call these things, but what is that?
So a GI or a geographic indication is a link to a place. So you've got two different things going on, which most people don't realize is you've got your standards of identity, which is legally how a country or a region, or usually a country, defines a product. So for example, Canadian whiskey has different standards of identity than a US whiskey. And so these will slightly differ. But a GI in particular is the connection to the land. And it is something that should be not reproducible in other areas of the world. A lot in terms of cheeses and meats, whether it's Parmesan or Cornish pasties, but we also see it with that of Scotch, actually. So they have like a GI for that of Islay. And it's what people don't realize, and I think it's a really underestimated thing these days, is that where a place is from works as a heuristic cue for consumers, meaning that when they're looking to purchase a product, they actually look at it as the amount of risk and how well they know it. And so what happens is well-known regions such as Islay, the risk is low because they know the quality is high. They know the flavor profile. It's based off of tradition. It's based off of history and heritage. And so if you're looking to go to a party and you want to bring a banger, you're looking at this Islay bottle and you're saying, this is amazing. I know it's more or less its collective reputation. But if
Hmm.
you're looking at a whiskey from Germany or South Africa or even France, their collective reputation is unknown. So their risk is unknown. So if you really want to bring that banger to a party, you may avoid that and maybe go towards a Scotch or a bourbon. And so it's about developing consumer trust as through a region. And that's really what geographical indications do.
Yeah, I mean, Islay, I think, is an example of one that obviously has like particularly strong equity around the world, right? It's so famous. Why do you think that is? What has made that particular region, GI, have such this indelible reputation around the world?
It's because from my research, what I've realized is that there's all these different like key points that you can touch upon. And I mentioned a lot of them earlier, whether it's history, heritage, tradition, processes, almost every single one of them, Islay touches upon. And because they cover so much ground, and when you the flavor profile is so distinct when you talk about Islay, that consumers instantly are like relatable and it's developed this cult following. But that being said, it's not the only way to develop a prestigious reputation because yes, Islay has been producing whiskey for a long, long time, but you look at that of Japanese whiskey, right? And Japanese whiskey has been producing, Japan's been producing whiskey for just over 100 years, not very long. They don't have the same length. They don't have, say, the same history and heritage. But in terms of prestigiousness, they're still up there. So they've done it through craftsmanship and attention to detail. And they've developed this collective reputation for these things. And now they're trying to install a GI themselves because they want to preserve that. And I think that's a big thing about creating a GI is the objective is to preserve the history and the heritage that does happen. Because a lot of times, once you create a successful region, other people realize that there's money to be made, and sometimes the standards lower afterwards. And that's one of the easiest ways to preserve something. That being said, I don't want to sound like I'm against GIs newly. It's just that a lot of regions are like, a GI is going to fix everything.
Mm.
And it's not, because the thing about a GI is that you have to figure out who you are first
Hmm.
before you can protect it. It's almost like telling like a 7-year-old what they're going to do for the rest of their lives. Like you don't know who they are. And these
Mm-hmm.
markets are too immature, but they see the value of a GI, because often if you have a GI, the value of a product can be worth like twice as much if it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, oh, we want a GI. But I'm like, but why? What is your connection? Have you figured that out yet?
Yeah.
And most of the time they haven't. And that's the reason why it's so important to discuss this with your fellow distilleries and start very early on and figure out what works for them and what makes you special and what makes you unique and why consumers like you and what your point of differentiation is.
Yeah.
And I just don't see enough people doing this, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, you talk in the story, you talk about the Danish, is it the Danish Whiskey
Yep.
Association is the
Yep.
name of your organization? That is kind of like one of these, is a newer organization, right? They're attempting to create, is it a GI or standard of identity? It's a GI for them because
So
it's like,
So the Danish have a Danish whiskey manifesto, and
mhm,
it's basically working on in almost like a certification trademark, saying if you see this logo, you know that we use Danish grains and we do all these different things,
mhm.
and it's a sign of quality for them, and that's one of the ways that they are starting to lean towards a GI, right? Because if you jump into a GI and you haven't figured out what everybody wants to do, what makes you special, it's hard. But these guys are not only working together on a Danish level, they're also working on a Nordic level because they know that Nordics together have their own collective reputation, right? And Nordic whiskey is developing a reputation. So they're working together at trade shows. They just had a conference a few weeks ago, and they're trying to figure out, okay, if we're gonna the value of this whiskey is gonna affect the value of my whiskey, how are we gonna work together to to control that narrative? And I think that's really what I wish people realize is that if they don't control the narrative will control them.
Yeah, and so it almost sounds like you're saying there's like a so okay, so maybe let's take a step back because there's sort of steps along this path to a GI, right? Or and maybe the destination is not necessarily the GI, but there are a variety of different ways that groups of distilleries that are united by a common cause in some way can create a group that advocates for their interests from all the way from a GI, like something super specific and detailed like champagne to something like you're describing the Danish Whiskey Organization, Danish Whiskey Association doing, which is almost more like a certification. Like I live in the Pacific Northwest, we have like Salmon Safe, right? It's like this certification that goes on wine that talks about like water conservation, proper, practices in the vineyard, stuff like that, where that is obviously just a much lower lift in terms of creating that organization and getting everyone on board. What's like, tell me more about that spectrum. What else is on that spectrum?
So the first thing I would say is talk to your neighbors, talk to the people who are in your area. And the reason is because, we go back to real estate. Real estate is something we all understand. If your neighbor sells their house for $5 million, that usually affects the value of your house. Let's think the exact same way, right? So you got to talk to them, say what they're doing and what they think is special about the region and how we can get together to do this. And so the first part is really just communication. And you have to figure out, are they using other local grains? Are they representing a sense of place? And once you kind of can agree upon certain things, and you don't need consensus, you do not need like everybody on board, but you need a certain group of people who are willing to work towards a cause. Because if you are from the Pacific Northwest and you try something from that area, it's kind of like, think about it in wine. If you tried a wine from somewhere and you hated it, you're going to write off that entire region altogether. It's going to work the same way as whiskey. So you want to develop that positive reputation together. How are we going to do this? What minimum standards are we going to agree upon that we are going to portray that? And also there's a lot of very small steps. So I live in Niagara. We have 6 amazing distilleries here that make whiskey, including Dillon's, including 40 Creek. These are well-known international distilleries. And before this year, there had never been a Niagara whiskey tasting ever across the board. So I hosted a Niagara whiskey tasting, right? Like I brought all the producers to a table together and I said, what makes Niagara whiskey different? Right. And it's just part of that. And then I started a website, www.niagarawhiskey.com. And if somebody wanted to visit Niagara, they didn't know where to go. They didn't know where the whiskeys are. So these are the little steps that you can do. And I think the thing is that people think that creating this change is expensive and time consuming. And in the long haul, yeah, I get it. It is. But sometimes you can take those little steps that once you figure out what makes you different and you've talked to your neighbor and you solidify certain ground rules, then you can create a certification trademark. And if that makes traction, then that's justification for a GI. That's the thing, is like that certification trademark works for a case study, more or less, to say this is the reason, because you have to apply for a GI. Say this is the reason why we want it. And then afterwards, you get written into GI agreements after that. So it is such a long haul game, but you look at some regions that don't have this. It's a very scary thing because if you go into a GI too fast, there's actually been certain regions in northern Italy who went into a GI too fast. It became too costly. People couldn't differentiate, and the entire industry collapsed.
Mm.
So everybody just says like GI is the solution, and I'm like, yes, if done the right way.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of hinted this in the story too, but there is an inherent tension, right, between GI or a trademark, and there's like some amount of gatekeeping has to happen for that to work, and there's I think an inherent tension there between people who want to protect an established or emerging style and people who are like, I don't want to do it that way.
Yeah.
And I'm your neighbor, you know? How are you seeing people kind of dealing with that dynamic?
I think it's all about compromise. And I think one of the things that I'm surprised about, and it's something I've really realized recently, is that people don't think long term in this industry. It's ironic because people put their barrels down for 3, 5, 10 years, no problem. They can think that way. But when it comes to a regional identity, there's no thought of that. And we're very impulsive. If I can make a sale, I'm going to make a sale. Why? Because I've had to put those barrels down for 3 to 10 years. And, that's a very expensive cost. And so I think that if you can take a step back and start giving and taking a little bit more, that's the biggest key. Because at the end of the day, and I always say, like, I always think of this in terms of wine. If someone were to say, that California Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc would have the market share in wine that it does today. If you were to say that 60 or 70 years ago, nobody would have believed you. And so this gives all new whiskey or spirits categories a fighting chance across the board. It needs to be done properly and it needs to be maintained properly. And if you accidentally, I said earlier, like if you don't control the narrative will control you. If you develop a negative collective reputation, then you have something called the horn effect as opposed to the halo effect. And that horn effect basically means that, oh no, I don't want to try that. I had that one time. And in wine, I don't know if you remember this, but I think it was in 1985, there was the Austrian wine scandal. Yeah, it was a big thing. And there was, I think it was like glycol was added to their wine. I forget exactly what it was. But the point is that only a few producers were doing this and their overall national wine production went down by 95%.
Yeah.
Because their collective reputation was destroyed by a few producers.
I think that happened also more recently in olive oil. Do you remember like when Spanish and Italian olive oils, they were like, oh, actually all of this is like much cheaper olive oil from North Africa that's being bottled and sold at premium prices with, Italian olive oil or something on it.
Exactly.
And it was a big, in the olive oil world, it had repercussions, that's
people's livelihood. That's an industry in itself, right?
Yeah.
And so this is the whole point is that, we like to think in the present, we're trying to survive, especially in today's economy, right? Like within spirits, like premium spirits, especially. I get that. But in some ways, I almost feel like that is many spirits producers' call to action to be like, okay, we're in this situation. How do we make sure we're in the best position the next time we are in a similar situation?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. You mentioned like the Northern Italian example, but like, are there other sort of like failure? Like, what are some common pitfalls for maybe like emerging or nascent GIs or trademarked any kind of organization? Like, how are people screwing this up in ways that maybe you could avoid if you thought ahead?
So people want to have, I always give this example too. It's like, I don't know if you remember this, but when you traveled 20 years ago, especially like I remember when I was a kid, my parents, they went to Europe and then they would come back duty free and they'd buy their Bacardi rum, right? And that was just like the go-to every single time. And now the go-to is I want to buy alcohol from where I'm from. So when I get home, I can retaste that and I can be transformed into that place. Right. And that is, it brings back the memories and it's the connection. And then you talk positively about it and you become a brand advocate for that region. And if you are tasting something that is reproducible somewhere else in the world, then that person really isn't having that authentic experience. And that's, I think the biggest thing is that people are, and I get the advantage of it. They're making up their history and they're making up their heritage. You can make a lot of that story up, but you're linked to the land you can't. And that really is the most critical part is that if somebody takes that home, are they taking a little piece of that property home with you?
Mm-hmm.
That I think that there's the biggest thing in agreeing on something, moving forward, and the hardest part is figuring out what makes you different.
Yeah. I think about this sometimes, like returning to Islay, for example, right? Like, I think one of the things that is so like if you ask just a person on the street, like, what's the deal with Islay whiskey? What does it taste like? I think 9 times out of 10, if they know anything about it, they'll be like, it's smoky, it's peated, right? That's like the number one sort of like trait that they associate with that whiskey. And there is maybe like a historical reason for that, right? Like when Islay whiskey was emerging in a commercialized way, right? Like it was hard to get wood, and so people were using peat, and so there was like an authentic,
Yeah.
real reason that it tasted that way.
Yeah.
Now, of course, you can get any fuel anywhere, right? That place-based attribute that's maintained in Islay, but it's no longer we're no longer constrained by our places in the same way, right?
Fully
And
agree.
so because we have transportation and you can ship stuff all over the world, and so there is an element of like choice, I guess, that didn't exist before, like when these really iconic products were being developed, where people really were like, we must work with what we have in this region and we can't work with anything else. We're not in that world anymore. People have a lot of choice about what kinds of ingredients they use, the style of, distillation they use, what kind of barrels they use. Like it's all on the table. So how would you like advise a group of distillers that are trying to establish sort of a regional identity when like the things that make their region specific are actually available to everybody?
So it's a very good question. And the first thing I would say is that most people don't realize what they do is special. That's the very first thing, is that like, um, I have a friend who's writing an article, and I don't want to get too much into it. And she was talking to a region, and they're like, but what we don't do is special. And you're like, no, but you don't realize that it is, because you constantly see it. So you don't realize it's special. What I mean is that you need to take a step back and realize, okay, first of all, what we do is different. And then after and dig deeper. So for example, you look at Australian whiskey and they are co-fermenting with wine. They are finishing their products with their wine barrels. You look at India and they're playing around with their aging because they have that crazy humid climate that makes things age differently. If you're looking at the Nordic countries, they're turning to teak wood to age their barrels in there. They're using smoking techniques that they've used historically because it adds flavor to the product. It's a lot of times you don't realize what you do is different. I had to talk to the guys at the Niagara whiskey thing, and I said, what makes you different? They're like, first of all, we're a wine region, an established wine region, but we also make wines that no one else, we make a little bit differently. We've got ice wine. We've got ice wine casks, like
Mhm.
how cool is that? So what's more authentic than the Niagara whiskey made, aged in ice wine casks?
Mhm.
So I get that it's more difficult than you think, but I think it's more about figuring out what makes your region as a whole different. Looking into those historic traditions that are already there, because we all have them, and embracing them. So it's not an easy quest,
Yeah.
but if you start a GI that people don't understand or has no unique asset to it, it will just end up costing you a lot and not make you different. The way that I always look at it, as I think about my father, because he loves whiskey. His knowledge is not, as much as an enthusiast, but he is the first guy to visit a distillery or a winery and buy a bottle. And then the next time he sees his friends, he puts it down on the table and he'll tell that story. But he'll only remember one or two sentences, but that's all you need, right? And it's like, okay, so if you're going to have someone like my father visit your distillery or winery in your region, what are those one or two sentences that he's going to tell?
I think that's such good advice because I mean that's it's so easy to forget this working in the industry, being close to it, that like most people are not dorks about this. They just want to have a nice experience and remember, yeah, 1 to 2 things that they can tell people when they share their product. And it's like that's a just a great piece of advice. What are those 1 to 2 things that you want that person to remember? Because that is the bedrock of the industry, right?
Yeah.
Like that's if you can't nail that, you can't make it happen.
And make it simple. We
Yeah.
overcomplicate things.
Yes.
Just like 1 to 2 things, what makes you unique? And that's really it.
Yeah. Any like pieces of advice that you would give to people who are listening to this who are thinking about like, oh, how do I figure out what makes me different? How do I talk to my neighbors? How do I take the first little baby steps? I think maybe that some sort of collective identity would benefit me and my community. Now what?
So, first thing I would say is don't underestimate the value of your place of origin, because again, as I mentioned earlier, it develops trust with the consumer. And it already existed in us subconsciously where, I say fine leather, you think Italy, I say fine wine, there's many places you could think of with fine wine. It could be Italy, could be France, but you have these like instinctive things and you want to have that instinctive positive association. So
Mhm.
don't underestimate the power of it. It will honestly could bring you more value than anything else. I think a lot of times people are working harder, not smarter. And the second thing is just bring everybody to a table and put down some bottles of whiskey. That's the thing. And take the baby steps. Take the URL, like start a website. You don't have to overcomplicate it. Create a map. It's something that doesn't have to be expensive. And the whole point of this is if you take the baby steps and it works, then take the next one. And if you take the baby steps and it works, then take the next one. But don't think that like a GI has to happen, otherwise it's a failure. It's more about understanding where you are and just taking those baby steps one step at a time.
Thank you. Any last thoughts that this has made you think of or that I should have asked about or?
No, I just I'm grateful for the opportunity to spread some of the knowledge from my own dissertation, and I hope that some people take this to heart. And if anyone is listening and wants to reach out to me, please feel free to do so.
Thank you, Andrea. Good to see
Thank
you.
you.